Okay, last time we spoke about, tempering grains, and there were three parts of what we spoke about that I glossed over pretty quickly or almost completely ignored, just because for the sake of time. So this time I'm just going to mention those three things so sort of they're out of context because they're not really in the place where they belong, but it's just, we were able to gloss over them to finish the topic. So this is just extra information. So one is, I had mentioned then, a question of whether, in order to make something Kosher Tumah, does it have to become Tofeach, or does it have to be Tofeach Hamnas Lehatfiach? And as I mentioned then, Rabbi Tzvi Young is the one who led me to a lot of these marmakamas that I'm about to tell you in this part over here now. So the Mishnah says, it's Mishnah Machshirim says it has to the water has to be Tofeach. It uses that word, and the Rambam explains, like I said last time, that Tofeach means is that if you touch this thing, you put this thing in your palm, it'll make your hands wet. Okay, now, Tofeach says, he tells you based on other Mishnayos, that the word Tofeach, when it says Tofeach in the Mishnah, it means just Tofeach. It doesn't not have to be Amanas Tofeach, as it says in other places. Like, for example, there's Mishnayos in Taharas, one in Perches and one in Perktes. In Perches, it says that in order for tumah to spread between foods, it has to be Amanas Lehatfiach. And then the Mishnah in the next parak says that the oil coming out of when you squeeze olives and you squeeze oil out of it, so oil is one of the shiva mashkim that can make something Kosher Tumah. It says if it's Tofeach, that's good enough. But it can't make the tumah spread from one to the other one unless it's Tofeach Amanas Lehatfiach. So again, it's telling you that when the Mishnah uses the word tefeach in a general sense, when it uses that word tefeach, it means just tefeach, just makes your hand wet. And if it meant that it has to be amanas hatefeach, enough that after I made this hand wet, if I touch my other hand with it, it would make the second hand wet. Then it says that. When it says that, but it doesn't say that, then it doesn't mean amanas hatefeach. So that's first of all one of his rayas. Okay, now Chazon Ish says. Chazon speaks about it in different places, and in one of the places when he's speaking on Reb Chaim, which I'm going to mention in a few minutes, he says he has a raya from a different Mishnah. The Mishnah Idias, this I mentioned last time, and the Mishnah Idias has a machlokes about certain tumah, not about Kosher Tumah, just a general machlokes. One man Yom says tefeach, one man Yom says tefeach hamnas lehatfiach. In other words, that again tells us that the word when a Mishnah would use the word tefeach, it means specifically tofeach, and when it meant amanas lehatfiach, it would say that. It would say amanas lehatfiach or tofeach lehatfiach. And the Rambam, he tells you also, the Rambam in a couple of places, when he brings Mishnayos, when it says tofeach, he describes tofeach being as that when you touch the thing, it'll make your hand wet. He doesn't say it needs to be amanas lehatfiach like he says in other places. So these are rayas that when the Mishnah uses the word tofeach, that means that specifically. So that's one sheet that when tefeach means just makes your hand wet, and when it means amanas lehatfiach, it means you have to make your hand so wet that it makes the other hand wet, and that would mean is that to be machshir something with kabel tumah, you only need tefeach. That's what the Mishnah says. It says tefeach. Reb Chaim, that's Reb Chaim Salvation. People asked last time. Reb Chaim says there is absolutely no such thing as a shear that's tefeach. Either you need to have nothing. Any mashu of moisture is enough, or you have to amanas hatfiach. There's no time when the shear it should be tefeach. He says, no, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. Sorry about that. The pachos mitefeach latfiach lechal be'shem me'ashka kal l'shum davar. There's no such thing as something that is tefeach without being amanas hatfiach, and that should be considered to be wet. Or he says, if you think that for something the shear is tefeach, well, then the shear for that is even a mashu would be enough also. And he says also, mishum the pachos mitefeach hatfiach lechal of shem mashka klal, not even considered a mashka, ve'ein a machshir in kabatum, and it means nothing. Okay, that's what Chaim says. And he brings a right this. Chaim brings a right this from a Rash in the third parak of Taharas, where a mish over there says something mashke tefeach, again, not relevant to being Kosher Kaptan, but just uses the term tefeach. And the Rash says, shehein lachin kol kach, shehein toiv chamanas hatfiach, v'tefeach lavdavka. Now, the Rash is wondering, if I'm telling you that the shear is that it has to be Amnas Lehatfiach, how come the Mishnah says Tofeach? And the Rash says, Lav Dafka. When the Mishnah says Tofeach, it meant really Amnas Lehatfiach. So Reb Chaim says that's a raya, that the word Tofeach doesn't mean just Tofeach. It really means Amnas Lehatfiach. It means Amnas Lehatfiach, but and the term is just being used loosely, just being Tofeach. Now, separately from that is Rav Moshe, who's actually talking about being Mashal Kabbat Tumah. He brings a raya from a Gemara in Pesachim that the word Tofeach, at least according to the way Rashi learns as Gemara, it's a Gemara in Pesachim on Daf Chaf Amanal, that it means very wet. Okay, basically close to Amnas Lehatfiach. Rav Moshe himself says he's not sure whether in order to be Mashal Kabbat Tumah you need Tofeach or Amnas Lehatfiach. But I'm just saying Rav Moshe brings another raya to that at least according to one sheet of Rishonim, the word Tofeach means more than just making your hand wet. Now, in contrast at Reb Chaim, in contrast to the Chazon Ish, now this Chazon Ish is not the one that's on in his Kilyonis to Reb Chaim. That was the one I said beforehand. This Reb Chaim, this Chazon Ish is in the Masechta Taharas and the Hosafas, which is printed in the back of the Chazon Ish, the Sefer called Taharas. It's in the Hosafas to Masechtas Taharas. He says, the Rash himself in a different Mishnah. The Rash I told you a minute ago. The Rash I told you a minute ago was in Perek Gimel, Taharas Perek Gimel. There's a Rash in Perek Aleph who's mesupik about whether the word Tofeach means plain or means Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. That's one thing the Chazon Ish says. So he's saying is, you're bringing me a raya from a Rash who says it in one place like that. He says you should just know the Rash himself is not so sure about that. And then, but in contrast to that, the Chazon Ish says, there's a shach in Hilchas, in Hilchas Nida who brings a Rashba, and others over there as well who say that the word Tofeach always means Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. Okay, that which is basically what Reb Chaim is saying, that Tofeach always means Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. And the Chazon Ish leaves off unsure. So the Rayas Lakan, whether it's true or it's not true, so he leaves it hanging. And I'm going to get to a third sheet in 1 second before I move on to the third sheet about whether Tofeach means Amnas Lehatfiach or not. What will happen? What will the Rashba or the Shach or whoever these shittas are who say, or the Reb Chaim who says that Tofeach doesn't always mean Amnas Lehatfiach? What will they do with the all these rayas that we brought, that there are times when Tofeach means not Amnas Lehatfiach? So Reb Chaim says, you need to have a better, you really have to understand a little deeper why it is, what it means that something has to be Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. He says, Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach, making something wet, is not different than any other shear in the Torah. There's a shear for how much matzah you have to eat. There's a shear for how big a wall has to be kosher for a sukkah or for an eruv. He says that's a shear for how much those things have to be. There's another shear for liquids. When you have a shear of a liquid, it has to be Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. That's what he says. It's another shear. It's just in the shear of the Torah. And there's a Taisus that's like that also in Chagiga. Chazon Ish says he argues on that. He says it's not really a shear. He comes from a Yerushalmi. Chazon Ish says there's a Yerushalmi that says that it's not a shear. It's just a hashara from a Chazal of at some point, if it's so little moisture, it's not even considered water. It's just like part of the food. So Reb Chaim says, based on this idea that he holds, again not like Chazon Ish, but based on what he holds, that it's a shear. He says is a real chiddush. He says is the food doesn't have to be Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach in every spot. There just has to be in total enough water that would be Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach. And once we have the shear of water, once we have that amount in play, so to speak, then that's good enough. We've had the shear. The fact that it breaks up into other places doesn't make a difference. So when all Mishnayos hold that every time you use the word Tofeach, it really means Amnas Lehatfiach. But in some cases, it looks like the water was spread over in several places, and that was good enough. Okay, and that's all the Mishnayos mean. They don't really mean to say that you can really get away with Tofeach. Really needs Tofeach Amnas Lehatfiach, and just using the word Tofeach because the spread apart water seems to be like that little. And now, according to that, if you hold like this Reb Chaim, that this chiddush that he's saying, then it's going to come out that for sure when we temper wheat, it's for sure going to be wet enough, because in total, of course, there's enough water to be Tofeach Hamnas Latfiach. The total amount of water. Our whole discussion last time had to do with, well, maybe the water on each grain is not Hamnas Latfiach, or not Tofeach even. He's saying that it has to just be a total of that amount of water. And as I said, it's a big chiddush. I'm not convinced. I highly suspect that the other poskim don't agree with it. Okay, that's what Chaim says. Now, so I mentioned so far two shittas. One is the Tofeach said that Tofeach means not Amanas HaTfeach, and Chaim says no, Tofeach means for sure Amanas HaTfeach. And the Mikdash David says, he's a Pirush on Kosher and Tyrus, he says a different shot, a third shot. He says, the Tofeach mentions such an idea also, and he says this: when we're talking about the liquid itself, like we want to know, is there enough liquid to be machshir's food l'kabel tuma, or is the liquid itself tummy? When we're talking about the liquid, then the rule is it just has to be tefech. Doesn't have to be amnas tefech. Just tefech is good enough. The Mikdash David actually says that you don't eat a shear at all, but of course that's not what he means, because he's coming from a Rash. His raya is from a Rash who says it has to be tefech. So it means when we talking about the liquid itself, you need just tefech. When the question is, can the liquid transfer tumah from here to something else? When we want to go to something else, then we need amnas latviach, which is roughly based on the idea that we know that to spread tumah, of any food can become tummy, but to spread tumah to another piece, it has to have a certain size. That's a general din. So this is something like that. And based on this chiluk, to say is that sometimes we need tefech when we talk about the liquid itself, which includes being machshir food l'kabel tumah. Sometimes we don't need. Sometimes we're talking about whether the water can spread tumah to something else. In that case, then we need amanas hatvech, and with that, he's miyashav a lot of the steers, the potential questions and steers that we had been dealing with. Okay, so that's one piece that I wanted to mention. I'm going to mention three today. One was about this tefech hamnas, whether the amount to be machshir l'kabel tumah is tefech or tefech hamnas hatvech. Okay, now the second one is shorter than that one was. And that is, I had asked a question, is that when you first put the water into the tempering, you put a lot of water, and then you quickly mix the grains to the point that within a few seconds, the amount of water that's in there is not even tefech. Okay, the grains are not tefech. And the question was, does that mean that the grains were hushel kabatuma because they got wet at the beginning? For the first few seconds, some of the grains were so wet. Okay, so when I spoke about it last time, I talked about, well, maybe some grains are and some grains are not. But now this time, I'm going to mention another possible answer, which seemingly is not correct. That's why I didn't mention it last time. But another answer might be you might think of, which I don't believe is correct. And that's like this: in order for something to be hushel kabatuma, not only does it have to get wet, like we spoke about, but you have to want it to get wet. Okay, it has to be ladas or leratzon, different ways to say it. You have to want it to have gotten wet. So now we have a question. Over here, we have a situation where you put a lot of water onto the grains. So we said, that should make shoshel l'kabel tumah. The problem is like this. I only want it to be wet for a second, which is to say I would not want my grains to be that wet, because if they be that wet, it would ruin the grain. Okay, but the company told us that, and it's obvious. If it would be that wet, it would not be good for it. They want it to just be very little wet, the amount that it actually gets to a few seconds later. So is that considered that it's hochshel kabatuma or it's not? Was that Leratzon? I'm sorry, was that Leratzon or was not Leratzon? So my question is going to hang on how to read, or how to understand the Rambam in Hilchos Tumas Oichlin. It's in the 12th parak, the second halacha. Because first he says if I wanted it to get wet, but not to stay wet, that's considered Leratzon and hochshel kabatuma. Sounds exactly like our case. I want it to get wet for a second, and then I want it to be not wet after a few seconds. I want it to be wet now, but I don't want it to be wet in 2 seconds from now. So that sounds like the Rambam says that's considered Leratzon. I wanted it to be. But on the other hand, the Rambam in the same din, he says if you make something wet just as some kind of a practical, necessary, functional reason, not because you wanted it to be wet. Like his example is, you wanted to float food down the river, so you stuck it in the river to get it down the river, but you had no interest in getting wet. The wet is unimportant. What you wanted it to do was it was a means of transportation. That's not considered Leratzon. So over here also, I don't want it. Remember, in din, it has wet means tefer. I don't want it to be tefer. My wanting it to be tefer is only a means to get it to be not tefer. My real goal is to get it to be not tefer. I don't want it to be wet now. I don't want it to be tefer now. It's just the only way to do it. So it's like floating the food down the river. It's just a way to get it from here to there. Just a practical, some kind of a step to get there. But it's not. I don't want it to be wet now. So I wasn't sure about what would the Rambam say about our case. Would that be considered Leratzon or was not considered Leratzon? Okay. So within the Rambam, we could be mesupik about that. The truth is, but what I just said from the Rambam, that is what the Rambam says, and we're mesupik about what he would hold about our case. But the truth is that most do not hold like what the Rambam says. Okay, this Rambam is based on the very first Mishnah in Machshirim, and the Mishnah is like this: Kol mashkeshet chilasa l'ratzon, alpha pisha ein soifer l'ratzon is considered hochshel kabatoma. Okay, so the Rambam says chilasa l'ratzon means you wanted it to get wet when you first got it wet, but you don't want it to be wet a little bit later. Okay, that's how the Rambam reads that Mishnah. Okay, but excuse me, but if you look there in the Chazon Nachum, it's a Pirush on Mishnah that's printed in the Mishnah there. He shows you that the Ravid to the Rambam I just told you, and most other Rishonim hold that not pshat what the Mishnah means. When it says Tchilas Leratzon and Seifer Leratzon, it's not talking about when you made the food wet. Tchilas Leratzon means is when you drew the water from the ground. When you took it out of the ground, did you want that water to come out of the ground? Was it on purpose, or did it just happen by itself? Did you want it to happen then? And that's Tchilas Leratzon. And Seifer Leratzon is when it gets onto the food, did you want it to be touching the food? And the Mishnah says either one is enough, either Tchilas Leratzon or Seifer Leratzon. So they would say, of course, this is Leratzon. That problem of it being not Leratzon is not true because you definitely wanted it to come out of the ground because you want to use it for tempering. Again, you don't have to want it to do something that would be machshel kabatoma. You just have to want it for a reason. You wanted it out of the ground. It didn't come out of the ground by mistake. And of course you did, because you wanted to use it for tempering. Even if tempering doesn't make it hochshel kabatoma, that's not the point. You wanted it for something. So most Rishonim would hold that being Leratzon, this is not a problem of Leratzon, it's Tchilas Leratzon. Again, according to Rambam, we were mesupik, but is this Tchilas Leratzon? But according to most Rishonim, we don't have a heter here to say, I'm sorry, we don't have a right to say it was Tchilas Leratzon, and that's why we don't. According to most, this would be considered Tchilas Leratzon. So we can't say that it's not hochshel kabatoma because it wasn't Leratzon. Okay, that was my second thing to tell you. And now the third thing is, again, this one's going to be a little bit longer. And the question was, it was my feeling that we should think that the grains are not hochshel kabatoma, even if some of them are, but most of them are not, and therefore the piece of challah you have in front of you is considered, partially hochshel kabatoma, mostly not hochshel kabatoma, and therefore you'd have to have the strictness. You wouldn't be allowed to burn it because of the part that's not hochshel kabatoma. We'd follow the roiv, and we would say roiv is not hochshel, and therefore you can't burn it for that kind of a reason. That's what I had said. But and then I said, okay, what happens if you don't agree with me? Okay, what should you do if you're mesupik? Either you're mesupik because you're not sure if I'm right, or you're mesupik because maybe there's a lot of water in this grain, maybe some other thing happened that would make it hochshel kabatoma. You're mesupik what to do, and skipping to the end was that we assume we follow the chazakah. But there was an in-between. Another possibility of what we could do if we're not sure if it was hochshel kabatoma. So what comes to mind is that there's a set of rules, and that we have a Safek, when we're mesupik if something is tummy or not, then there's a set of rules special for Safek Tumah, and that is, if a Safek Tumah happens in Rosh Hashanah, then the thing is tahar. If the it's tummy. If the Safek Tumah happens in Rosh Hashanah, then it's tahar. Okay, that's a basic rule. Now, so then, what is our case? Is this a Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah, in which case it's tummy, or is it a Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah, in which case it would be tahar? So, the rule is like this. If there are 3 people present, that's considered a rabbin. That's a Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah. 3 people makes Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah. So that means in the flour mill, there's going to be more than 3 people available around. So since the Safek happened in the flour mill, so a first thing you'd say is, 3 people are there, Safek Rosh Hashanah, which would be tahar. Okay, now, there's a Mishnah Achron who says the 3 people have to be Jewish, in which case this would be Kashrus Yachid. But let's put that on the side for a second. Let's just assume that there are 3 people. Let's think that there are 3 people there and should be Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah and should be tahar. However, the problem is like this. The reason why it's not correct is like this. The Taisus in Soita says, based on the Gemara, that if something happens in a location where people cannot possibly see, those people don't count towards making this into a Rosh Hashanah. Okay, now, others don't learn the Gemara that same way, but this is what Taisa says. Now, so in our case, whether the grain became wet enough to, in the dampening machine, in that little machine, this little machine that stays in there for a few seconds, where the people could tell whether it became wet enough or didn't come enough, there's no one who could see. You can't see into that machine. There's no one who could see what's going on in there. Maybe it's a confined space, maybe it's not a confined space, I don't know, but no one knows what's going on in there. Okay, it's this black box. The grain goes in on one side, it pops out on the other side. Whether it's in there, it's Kosher L'Kabel Tumah or not, no one has any idea what's going on. So in which case, those so therefore, those people don't, so to speak, don't count towards making a Rosh Hashanah. Means it's a Rosh Hashanah. Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah is Tameh. Okay, so in which case we have to treat it as Tameh. That's step 2. But that's not correct either, and that's because there's another set of rules, and that is we only say Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah is Tameh only is when there are people who are part of the story, people involved in the story, or those are people who could be asked whether it's Tameh or not, which is called Yesh B'das Lishal. There's someone who you could potentially have asked, like by a Saita, you could have asked the people involved what happened. Okay, and someone there's someone who could know. But if not, if there's no one there, it's Ein B'das Lishal, then Safek Tumah is Tahar. Okay, so so Memanashach. If we say that the fact that the grain is in this machine and no one can see what's going on means that those people don't count. Those people don't count, then it's considered a Rosh Hashanah because there aren't 3 people around. And if you say is that the people, no, that doesn't count. It's still considered Rosh Hashanah. Somehow that's still considered Rosh Hashanah because there are people around and they know what's going on. But those people are for sure in B'das Yishal. So for other reasons, it's Tahar. In other words, either we're going to say there's no people here, in which case it's Rosh Hashanah, or say yes, there are people here, but those people are in B'das Yishal because there's no way for them to possibly know what's going on. Okay, so then those are reasons why Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah is not going to be Tameh over here. Now, another 2 things I'm going to just throw in, that are questions of whether this is considered to be Ein B'das Yishal. First is is if the person, I'm going to skip that one. Next is what happens if, I'm going to just skip these 2 parts. Okay, anyhow, let's move on. Now, the truth is, but if we dig into this a little bit deeper, of the dinim of Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah, it turns out that there's another reason why the whole rules of Safek Tumah, I was telling you that it should be considered Tahar within the rules of Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah. But the truth is, there's reason to say that the whole set of rules of Safek Tumah doesn't apply at all. Okay, and that's because like this. The din of Safek Tumah Rosh Hashanah, that's Tameh, and Rosh Hashanah, it's Tahar, comes to the din of Saita. And when we decide whether a food is within those rules, whether this should be considered Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah, should fit to the rules, all has to do with whether this case is similar to the case of a Saita. So the Gemara says like this. In the case of a Saita, we know that the man and the lady were in the same room together, and the suffix is whether they were Mazana. Okay, that's our question. We're not sure what happened over there. Okay, so there's a mission in Taharis that has a machlekes like this. What happens if there's a suffix whether a Tameh and Tar object were even in the same room together? Rabbi Lezer says is that case is not like a suffix Saita, because in suffix Saita we know that they were in the room together. We just don't know if they were Mazana. Over here, the Tahar and Tameh weren't even in the same room. So Rabbi Lezer says no, that's not Daimel Saita, and therefore the rules of Safek Tumah don't apply. But that's what Rabbi Lezer says. But the din is not like Rabbi Lezer. The din is like the Chachamim, who say it is considered Safek Tumah. So now the question is like this. Now there's a question that the Taisus Rosh in Chulin is like this. We had a knife that was used to shecht an animal, and it was shechted in a way that we're not sure if there was any blood on the knife. Now, blood is one of the Zayin Mashkim. It's one of the things that can make something Kosher L'Kabel Tumah. So the question is, question is whether this meat was now Hoshel Kabal Tumah. Meaning when it's an animal, it's not a piece of meat, it's not food. Now it was shechted, and usually when you shech the animal, the blood that's on there will be Mashal Kabal Tumah. The question here is, we're not sure if the animal was Hoshel Kabal Tumah. So Ram Rutenberg says this is a suffix about whether the meat is tummy, and we should consider a Safek Tumah, which is to say we follow the Chacham that we're not sure if the tummy and the tar touch each other. In this case, we're not sure if the blood touched the meat, and therefore we paskin like the Chacham that is within the rules of Safek Tumah, and therefore the meat is considered, yes, it was Hoshel Kabal Tumah, which, well, if it's Rosh Yachad or Rosh Rabin, and then based on that we'll decide whether it's Hoshel Kabal Tumah. And the Rosh brings this Maram Rutenberg, and he argues. He says, no, it's not true. He says, in the case of the Mishnah, the question is about the tumah itself. Did the tumah and tahar touch each other? Okay, that's what the shaila is about. But over here, we're not talking about did it become tumah. We have no question whether the animal, the piece of meat, touched something that was tumah. Here we're talking about a prerequisite to the tumah. Was it hochshel l'kabel tumah? He says hochshel l'kabel tumah. That's way different than soita. In soita, we know that they had the prerequisites. They were in the same room. We just don't know whether they were mazan or not. But over here, we don't even know if the prerequisites happened. We don't even know if they came into the same room at all. I'm sorry, we don't even know if it was in Hochshel. That's it's not even whether in this. So the Machlokes in the Mishnah was whether in the same room. And then yes, that's considered also part of considered a Safek Tumah. But we have a Safek. If anything happened, the Rosh says it's like we're not sure if the husband even did kinui. If the husband didn't do kinui, we haven't even gotten into the open up the Masech Saita yet. We haven't even gotten to there yet. Okay, so he says whether something is when we have a Safek, whether something is Hochshel l'kabel Tumah. When we have a suffix something was Hochshel l'kabel Tumah, that's a suffix that is not even in the rules of Safek Tumah. So first I had said to you was within the rules of Safek Tumah, this should be considered. This should be tahar. This should be considered tahar. And now I'm saying to you is that it's not even in the rules of Safek Tumah altogether. Okay, the Chazon Ish doesn't bring this rush. He doesn't quote the Rush, but him it's pashut. He thinks that we have a suffix whether a food is hochshel l'kabel tumah is not treated like a Safek Tumah at all. Okay, he doesn't bring the Rush, this type of Rush, but he says the same thing. He says not even a question that's not in the rules of Safek Tumah. Okay, there are other achronim who say it a little bit differently about why it's not like Soita, but again the same conclusion. I'll give you for example. They base it on a shita mukbetzes in Ksubis. I have it here from Radar Pravarsky said it from Chaim Salvechik, and a similar thing from Cheskel Bramsky said it over. Gusman brings it also that we only say Safek Tumah. The rules of Safek Tumah only apply when the shaila is about the tamei item, but when the shaila is about we're not sure if did the tummy item touch the tahor item, or did it come into the room with the tahor item. That's when we say the rules of Safek Tumah. But if there's a suffix related to the item which is becoming tummy, that's the suffix based on that item. That's not Safek Tumah. Now, usually they're the same, because if the tummy touched the tahor, the shaila is about the tummy, the thing that was mitame, and did it make the other thing tummy? It sort of goes together. Here, when we have a shaila that's just about the thing becoming tummy, but not about the thing that's mitame, then when I'll read you some word. The kol hadin Safek Tumah shus yachad sveika tummy, hainu rak ma Safeku b'mitame. If him kol Safeku b'hanitma, go in Safek im hochshel l'kabel tumah, bezel have din Safek Tumah shus yachad sveika tummy. It's not in the rules of Safek Tumah at all. Again, because it's not daiming to Soita. Okay, anyhow, so just the way we ended up. So this whole thing I didn't say last time. But therefore, because it's not in the rules of Safek Tumah or the rules of Setar, because it's not in the rules of Safek Tumah, therefore, I thought that the right thing was, the Chazon Ish himself says, when you're not sure what to do because it's not in the rules of Safek Tumah, so what do? You follow the Chazaka, and the Chazaka is that it was not Hochshel l'kabel Tumah when it came off the ground, and therefore we assume, if we're not supposed whether it became Hochshel, we assume that it did not become Hochshel l'kabel Tumah.